We are our stories. When we offer our stories, we communicate who we are and what's important to us. You are an important member of the human story. The sum total of what we share defines our role in that story. So tell your story to someone. Write it down or print it out. Share it with a friend or social media. Put it on the fridge for inspiration. Stash it in a drawer or a book to be discovered. For as long as we have had records, we have shared these stories as a way to offer our culture and personal experiences in exchange with others. Whether they are words spoken by the warmth of a fire or typed under the glow of a monitor, we can use them to build and rebuild that middle ground where ideas can be shared. When we seek out the stories of other people, we learn about them and what is important to them. As we receive these stories, we can discover things about ourselves. Others pay attention to how we receive their stories and learn about us as well. When the story giver recognizes that we are engaged, a meaningful connection can be created or reinforced. A funny tale about discovering a lost item in an unusual place can transform an ordinary event into a reminder that all of us share this human experience. That time we spend sharing stories with people may reveal differences to be explored and yet still brings us together under the illuminating light of a universal truth. The truth that there is so much in common with everyone.
We are invited to listen deeply this month. I wonder what you will notice, and I wonder what you'll hear. Who is speaking in the stories that you listen to? Who is included in the narrative and who is left out? The upcoming fall holidays lift up stories celebrated in our recorded history. The stories I share today with my family are not going to be shared in the same way that I remember learning them when I was in preschool. I won't say, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. I tell a different story. One that is less one-sided, one that I consider to be more accurate. And it's more of a conversation with my children than a story. At General Assembly this year, I was invited to think more deeply about these stories and these conversations. General Assembly is a gathering of Unitarian Universalists from congregations all around the country and the world, and we gather for worship, workshops, and the business of our association. And it was held virtually this year. And the theme was rooted, inspired, and ready. Being rooted in our history and our faith, and to recognize the ground on which we stand and the historical stories that build that foundation. That's what GA was all about. And many of the workshops focused on partnering and learning from Indigenous people and recognizing that it's been 400 years since the arrival of the Mayflower to the eastern shores of this land. Many of these sessions at GA were recorded and they're all available to you online. I have been enjoying going back and watching them again. And one of those was a lecture called the Foz Lecture. And at GA, the Foz Lecture is offered every year, and it always lifts up some aspect that we can learn from religious educators. And this year, it challenged us to think about how Native American stories are taught and how they're shared. The speakers were Jean Mendoza, who adapted the book that I have right here, The Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young People. And Dr. Natalie Martinez wrote its study guide, and together they led this lecture. They spoke about the importance of representation in literature and how that affects how people learn. And in the beginning of the Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young People, There is a note to readers, and it helped inform the language that I use for this service, and I share it with you all now as well. Indigenous, American Indian, or Native American. You may have heard people use these three different terms to refer to people that are the focus of this book or this worship service. All three are correct, depending on who you ask. The three terms are also used interchangeably by federal, state, and tribal governments. The most accurate term anyone can use is the specific name of the nation that you're talking about. And throughout this book and this worship service, we will be using specific names. And when we are talking about two or more nations, we will use broader terms. You will see that I use this language as well as those who I quote in this service. So Dr. Natalie Martinez is a professional educator and a curriculum developer of Pueblo-based curriculum. She was one of the speakers in this lecture, and she's a former administrator and teacher of a tribally controlled middle school located in the Pueblo Nation. And she shared this story of her teaching technique with her students. So every year, she teaches New Mexico state history with her 7th graders. And Martinez would ask her students when Indians in New Mexico were given the right to vote. After several guesses, she would tell them about Miguel Trujillo, how he was absolutely critical in Indians getting the right to vote. So she asked them to turn to him in their textbooks. They look in the index, in the table of contents. They look at all the pictures they can find, reading all the captions. They scour the Indian sections of their textbooks, but they can't find any references to Trujillo. At each dead end, she encourages them to look harder. He's got to be there somewhere. He's an important part of your history. After much frustration, she brings out supplemental materials about Miguel Trujillo. They learn how he was a veteran in the United States Army, and when he returned from World War II, he went to vote, but he was turned away. There was a law in New Mexico that Indians who were not taxed could not vote. Miguel sued the state of New Mexico and won. And this part of history was nowhere to be found in the state textbooks. So many stories are lost if we only teach and learn from one source. So building up school libraries, church libraries, home libraries, and seeking out more resources and stories is one way that we can continue our free and responsible search for truth and meaning, especially as Unitarian Universalists. So what kind of books should we add to our shelves or our own devices? I have a slide to share by Jean Mendoza from the FOS lecture. Mendoza talks about windows and mirrors, how it's important for some books to reflect back on the reader so they can see themselves in the material, as well as being an accurate window to share with those who are reading, who are going to learn something new. She talks about how it's important that these stories are accurate, and so many books and materials that have been written about Native people have been written by people who are not of that nation. And as she says, they are biased, they have stereotypes, and they have a whopping dose, as she says, of white settler supremacy. So the books that we're looking for have sovereignty, of self-governance, have resistance to imperialism, and have the message that Native people are still here and loved and valued. And Kevin Millard, who wrote Fry Bread, points out that what Most people know about Native culture, they learn in grade school. So it's imperative to dispel stereotypes and offer accurate and current books for children today. He affirms that picture books are the first step of social justice for Native people because it's dispelling stereotypes that people vanished. In the author's note from Fry Bread, he explains, the story of Fry Bread is a story of American Indians embracing community and culture in the face of oppression. It's commonly believed that the Navajo were the first to make fry bread over 150 years ago. And the basic ingredients may appear simple: flour, salt, water, and yeast. Yet history behind this community anchor is anything but. Despite colonial efforts throughout American history to weaken tribal governments, fracture indigenous communities, and forcibly take ancestral lands, Indian culture has proven resilient. Millard says that in reading Fry Bread, he hopes that people understand Native Americans are still here, still alive, and we have persisted. We are resilient, and we are not going anywhere. He said that in an interview sitting next to his son. Fry Bread is a book with many layers. It provides both windows and mirrors that Jane Mendoza describes. And seeking out and reading books like this is one way that we can listen deeply. Another is through relationship building and having conversations where we can truly listen. A local opportunity for partnership and relationship building is available through Indigenous New Hampshire. Their website is indigenousnh.com. And I'm asking Sherry to put that link in the chat box for those of you who are interested. Their website and social media presence shows that they're an active team of co-conspirators, including local tribal leaders, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, staff, and faculty at the University of New Hampshire. And there are local community activists and volunteers, artists, filmmakers, researchers, and high school students. Indigenous New Hampshire offers guidance and examples of land acknowledgements. And here is their open invitation to all of us. At this time, we fight the invisibility of Indigenous people in the state of New Hampshire and call on you to join us in adopting this statement or creating your own that reflects local Indigenous peoples past and present, their lasting connection to the stewardship of the land and waterways that we now refer to as the state of New Hampshire. Further, we aim to participate in lifting up local Indigenous cultural heritage, and we adopt some Abenaki, a dialect of the Algonquin language family, terms in the statement. And here is a statement that they offer and suggest that we could adopt and create our own using this as a guide. So it would start with this talk, this event, this worship service takes place on Ndakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways of the All-Nobak people. We are stewards. All-Nobak people have stewarded Nakina throughout the generations. That is an example of one land acknowledgement. That's a guide. And here's an example of one on a window at the Currier Art Museum. They follow the similar guide, and it looks like it's right there on a glass doorway window that you would see on your way into the building. Another example of a land acknowledgement is much smaller here, but I want to show you that it includes a map of this region where we live. And this is a land acknowledgement at the Strawberry Bank Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And so I'm curious. I'm curious if there are church members who would be interested in this kind of research and relationship building project. What would a Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashua land acknowledgement and process look like? I wonder if this is an area where you would like to connect with us. And if so, please let me know. And another project that's in the works for this year is another worship service. We will work with church member Mandy Eberly and her family to help co-lead a worship service this spring. Mandy Eberly will share the stories learned from her grandmother Hawkeye, a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. Mandy would visit her grandmother every other weekend on the reservation in Florida where she lived. I look forward to creating this worship service with Mandy and her family to offer this moment to connect and listen deeply to the stories that we share. So I also wonder about your stories. What are the family stories that are important to you? I hope that you share them with one another and you think about them. I invite you to share what stories have influenced you and what short stories you now want to seek out. What will you make room for in the bookshelves of your heart? What will you listen to and what will you hear?
Our benediction is a poem written by John Trudell, Native American author, poet, actor, musician, political activist, and a distant relative of mine. I was listening to the voices of life, chanting in unison, carry on the struggle. Till generations surge together in resistance to meet the reality of power. Mother Earth, embrace her children in natural beauty to last beyond oppressor's brutality. As the butterfly floats into life, we are the spirits of natural life, which is forever the power of understanding. Real connections to spirit is meaning our resistance, our struggle is not sacrifice lost. It is natural energy properly used.